Welcome to Dark Fantasy X. I'm the Dark Fantasy X gamer, and Dark Fantasy X is my game. Dark Fantasy X is a tabletop role-playing game similar to Dungeons & Dragons, probably something you're very familiar with. But it has a lot of differences to it, and it's one that I've created, although I've used systems and tools that were kind of already available. I can't claim to have created them from scratch. There's a lot of homemade games these days. In fact, it's kind of a golden age of that, and some of them are good enough that their creators put some good production values into creating a document and actually put them up for sale. And you can buy games like Knave, Index Card RPG, Eldritch Dark, Five Torches Deep, and then even some of the really big names like Old School Essentials, Basic Fantasy, Labyrinth Lord, Swords and Wizardry. Some of these are simply clones, if you will, of older editions of Dungeons & Dragons, but some of them do something else, and they're kind of unique in their own way. Why would I create another one? There's all these choices already available. Well, the answer is, of course, that none of them were exactly what I wanted. And I spent years on a holy grail quest to find exactly the game that was perfect for me, but I could never find one until I basically had to take one that was close and modify it and create it to be exactly what I needed it to be. The biggest difference between Dark Fantasy X and Dungeons & Dragons is that Dungeons & Dragons, especially in 5th edition, is a high fantasy game, and Dark Fantasy X has a different mood and a different tone. So let's say, for example, that D&D 5th edition is the Avengers movie. Dark Fantasy X would be more like the Daredevil show. It would be dark, it would have a more grounded tone, and a mood that owes as much to horror stories as it does to fantasy stories. Which begs the question, why am I listening to this music and why do I have this background? Let's change that real quick. Okay, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay also does this, so it's not like this is totally new and original. But that's kind of a complicated and fiddly system, and it's not really what I wanted. It also has its own setting that is very similar to kind of a gothic, old medieval Europe, and I didn't want that. I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to have a little bit more of there's elements of Dark Fantasy X that are like that, but others are more like an American frontier. Others are more kind of its own thing that's quite different. So Dark Fantasy X is not only a system, but it is also a setting. And plus, I've just been tinkering and homebrewing since 1980 at least. That's just kind of how we had to do it back in the day, and it's in my DNA, my gaming DNA. Not only that, for that matter, it's 100% within the purview of the old-fashioned gaming to do it that way. Which brings me to my next point. I am old-fashioned, but I am not old school. Today, the D&D playing world is split into largely two camps. I guess there's probably a third camp if you count Pathfinder, but I haven't heard much about that in the last few years. So it's largely split into two camps. There's the vast majority of people who I think play 5th edition, and then there's a very active community of people called the OSR, the Old School Renaissance or Old School Revival. Different people interpret the acronym to mean different things, but basically it means that they are playing either older editions of the game, or they are playing games that are retro clones of those older editions. They're designed to feel almost exactly the same, or they're playing games that are similar to those older editions of D&D, but which kind of add their own twist or do something a little different. My tastes and the way that I play was ingrained in me in the late 70s and early 80s. So a lot of what the OSR is doing is familiar to me, but I didn't necessarily like a lot of it back then, and I don't necessarily like it now. For instance, I hated the rules. I always thought they were Byzantine and arcane and esoteric. They didn't make a lot of sense. There's too many rules that cover too many situations, when the whole gist of much of that early wave of games was that it was supposed to be fairly simple. It was supposed to offer you a framework, and what you used to do is you would describe in normal, natural language what your character was going to attempt to do, and if the GM decided that there was an element of risk to that, he would tell you what to roll, and he would say, okay, make a check against, this stat or whatever. Dark Fantasy X works more like that. But the big part of the problem is that I came into the hobby because I was a fan of reading fantasy fiction. I was not into wargaming. Much of what the game assumed that you were actually going to do, I also had no interest in because it did not resemble anything that I was reading in the fantasy fiction. I'm always find it very curious that Graham Davis, who was an author for the Enemy Within campaign in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, said that Brian Ansell, who was the head of Games Workshop at the time, basically came to him and tasked him to write an investigative horror scenario for a fantasy setting, because those investigative and horror scenarios were very popular in Britain at the time. Call of Cthulhu was very popular in Britain at the time. And so the Enemy Within campaign was, in many ways, it was a Call of Cthulhu adventure set in a D&D-like fantasy world. And in some ways, that's what I'm doing. I have a horror and investigation type of game, but not a dungeon crawling game. And that doesn't mean that it's totally different. I kind of feel like not only is the horror and investigation important, but so is the swashbuckling action. If you want to think of some movies that have exactly the right tone and feel that I'm going for, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these are necessarily great movies. In fact, many of them I would say are not good movies at all, but they have the exact right tone and mood that I'm going for. Think of The Mummy with Brendan Fraser from the late 90s. Think of Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman from the early 2000s, and think of the Solomon Kane movie with James Purefoy, also from about the same era. That is how I want my game to feel. Kind of like that. You do have swashbuckling action heroes, but it is a dark fantasy horror setting, and those swashbuckling heroes better be careful not to bite off more than they can chew. Another major difference, a lot of people say that Dungeons & Dragons is generic fantasy. I actually do not believe that this is true at all. I don't think D&D is generic. It is broad. There's a lot of things you can do within D&D, but the reality is that all D&D settings resemble each other more than they do any other fantasy setting. If you got Elminster from the Forgotten Realms, Mordenkainen from Greyhawk, Raceland from Dragonlance, and I don't know, whoever from Eberron, and whatever other setting you want to envision, and they all sat down, for the most part, they would all recognize each other's worlds. Magic would work the same way, characters would work the same way. There's this whole leveling kind of curve that everybody goes through. Religion and whatnot is the same. And sure, they've got some different gods in their pantheon, but they all work the same way, and you could slot one in place of another, and it wouldn't make much difference. No other fantasy setting outside of Dungeons & Dragons works anything like this. So I don't believe that Dungeons & Dragons is generic. I think it's broad, but it's not generic. Dark Fantasy X does not even try to pretend like it is all things to all settings. It evokes a very specific tone, mood, and feel that is designed specifically to do exactly what I want it to do and nothing else. It kind of takes the pretense of D&D and says, look, come on guys, D&D does not do that, so let's stop pretending, and D&D does D&D, Dark Fantasy X does Dark Fantasy X. Now, for some people who are familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, this means that there will be some iconic things that you'll maybe be surprised to find are missing. Elves, dwarves, halflings, some of that stuff. Instead, most of my race selections are demi-humans. And I don't mean this in the sense that Gary Gygax did, but rather in kind of the ancient Greek sense. Demi-humans are humans, but they've had at some point in their past some kind of admixture from some kind of supernatural source, like a demon, a fallen angel, a werewolf, the Ifrit from the City of Brass, to name just a few. And I don't have tons and tons of races. I actually have come around over many, many years to see the wisdom of Gary Gygax's mainly humanocentric inclinations in setting design. And so I do have a place for demi-humans, and I know that as a player, people like to have those kind of options, but this is very much a humanocentric setting, and humans kind of dominate, even more so than they do in most D&D settings. I've also got a very different magical system. What you're probably used to from Dungeons & Dragons is you pick a magic-using class or a cleric class who also has spells, and your class gives you magic, and it works in a way that is largely called Vancian. It has spell slots, and you spend your spell slots, and then when you do, you're done for the day. I do not have that type of magic, although my magic is heavily influenced by older pulp writers as well. But I would call my system Lovecraftian rather than Vancian. Anybody can learn to do magic if they're willing to risk it, regardless of class. So there is no magic using class. Anybody can pick it up, but there's a risk involved. And so maybe you don't want to, even if you have the opportunity. Then again, of course, there will be other players who that's exactly what they want to do, and it will drive a search for the occult, which will lead to all kinds of adventuring opportunities as they try to seek this stuff out. So for my final point, and I think this will be obvious from what I said before, Dark Fantasy X is not meant to superficially resemble D&D. It is the same kind of game. You sit around at a table or over a Zoom meeting, if you're not doing it in person, with a couple of friends. You roll a bunch of funny shaped dice. You take on the role of a fantasy character in a fantasy setting, and you go and have adventures. In that sense, it's obviously exactly like D&D, but when you start digging into the details, it's going to look different. It's going to have a very different setting. It's going to have a very different set of assumptions about what the characters are actually doing. The rules and the stance with regard to rules versus rulings is pretty different than 5th edition D&D. And it even has some notable departures from the OSR D&D or D&D-like games as well, including the retro clones. So in the next video after this in the series, I'm going to start a walkthrough of my rules. And I've already written all these rules. I've actually had them for quite some time. I'm going to walk through all the sections and explain what they do and how they do it, starting with character creation. So the next video, I think we will talk about the races of Dark Fantasy X. Anyway, hope to see you next time, and hope that you enjoyed hearing my journey about how I came to my Holy Grail game that's exactly perfect for me, and maybe it'll inspire you to do the same thing and create your own game that's exactly perfect for you too. See you next time.